Greetings, math fans. All right, so this is Note Sheet 4, and we're talking about just a little bit different topic. Actually, two kinds of problems today. So the first one is when we talk about true and false, positive and negative. Now, what you've really heard of is if you have a test taken and you get a false positive reading, or you have a false negative reading. That's really what you've heard of most. And what the word true and false, let's talk about that first. The word true means when I'm taking a test, so let's say I'm having a test for strep throat. Okay, true means that the test worked. Okay, again, I get the, whatever they do to a strep test, and then it comes back and it's a successful test. It may say that you have strep, which means it's a true positive, or it might say, hey, you don't have strep, which is a true negative. But true means that the test worked. And I like to, again, using strep I think is a good example because it's going to occur the most often, true. And why does it occur the most often? Is because if it didn't occur the most often, that means the test would not be working. Okay, true means the test worked. It's important. The true means the test worked. It gave you an accurate reading. Okay, if it was false, that means it would give you an inaccurate reading. And that's what you've heard of most, right? If I have a false negative, that means, oh man, it didn't work. It gave you a wrong answer with finding if you had strep or not. Okay? So true occurs the most often, and I even say that the test should give accurate results. You're not going to go to the doctor and take a strep test if the test is wrong a lot of the times, right? You're hoping that the test is correct, and it's going to tell you whether you have strep or whether you don't have strep. Okay? So again, let me just mark this here. So true means the test is correct. False means the test was not correct. Okay? So that's what false is. And then we have something called positive and negative. And so positive means the test results show that you do have, and I use the word disease here, strep, whatever. So positive means, hey, you do have it, and negative means you don't have it. Okay? So here, I got a nice little picture here. If it tested positive, and positive, by the way, again, occurs the most often. So let's look at this guy right here. This is kind of a nice chart here. Let's get back to it here. Okay, so this is what I want to look at here. Notice that the true negative and true positive. True occurs the most often. Okay, so why does true positive and true negative, why does it look almost the same occurrence? Is because sometimes since the test is going to work, it might say, hey, negative means I don't have the disease. So I did true means the test worked, but it's negative, I don't have the disease. So true negative right here. True negative. And true positive means, hey, the test worked, but it's affirmative, I do have the disease. So that's what it means by positive. I do have the disease. So this is true positive. Okay? And then the negative again is, let me use a different color here. This is false negative and false positive. So it means false means, hey, the test didn't work. All right, so here it is, false positive. It didn't work, but it's saying that I tested positive, which I really don't have the disease, but it's false. Okay, it says I did have the disease where I really didn't have the disease. And this one is saying false negative, which is saying, hey, the test was wrong, and it's saying I don't have the disease, but boy, I really do have the disease. Okay, that's why it's even under this category, right? Has disease, but it came out with B. Yeah, it was wrong. It's false. The test was wrong, and it's saying I don't have the disease, which is actually, right, people are happy, but you really got the disease, which is really bad. Okay? All right. So I try to show you this with a little bit of probabilities. This area right here, that's the small area because it's false positive, false negative, and as opposed to the big area here, that's going to be true positive and true negative. So again, true occurs the most often because the test is working. Okay? And false means the test didn't work. That's bad if it didn't work. And then you have positive, yes, I had the disease, and negative, no, I did not have the disease. All right? So let's do an example. Okay, so professional bodybuilders are tested for steroids every year. They're given a test which gives a 10% false positive result and a 15% false negative result. So remember, false doesn't occur very often, which you can see. It's only 10% of the time where it occurs for positive and 15% where it's negative. Okay, so it's commonly known that 20% of all bodybuilders use steroids. So basically, this is how I'm going to make a tree diagram here, and let me just write out here. So 20% of the bodybuilders use steroids. I'll call it roids because it's just easier to use. Okay, so I'm going to kind of branch off here. And if 20% use it, we're going to put 0.20, and this other one is going to be 0.80. And we're saying 20% use roids, and 80% don't use steroids. Okay? So that's our first part of the tree, and then we're going to do the second part is I'm going to split this off. Each one of these is going to be the test is positive and the test is negative. So let me just fill this in and then I'll explain what I'm talking about here. Test positive and test negative. Okay, so again, 20% use steroids, 80% don't use steroids. So if you use steroids, okay, you really should be tested positive, right? Doesn't that make sense? If I use steroids, shouldn't that test come back as positive that yes, I did use steroids? So basically, it's a false, that you see this right here, the 15% false negative. This goes here. So this is, let's do it in red. This is 0.15. Okay, so what this is saying is the test was wrong and I came up with a negative result. Okay, so in other words, I'm using steroids and it's coming back and saying, no, you don't use steroids. So I'm lucky, right? But it's saying it's a negative, the result is wrong, and it's saying, hey, I don't use steroids when I really should be tested positive. I should be using steroids. It should say, hey, you do use steroids. So that's 0.15, and this is 0.85. Okay, let's go in. If you don't use steroids, shouldn't you test negative? Of course I should test negative. So if I test positive, that's a wrong answer, okay? And it says a 10% false positive. Okay, so this is 10% right here. And again, this is saying, hey, I don't use steroids, but I tested positive. That's not good. So 10% of the time when I don't use steroids, it's going to show that I did use steroids. So it's a false, right? We're underneath here. It's a false positive. That's the false positive because the test is wrong, right? Because it's saying I don't use steroids, but the test is actually saying, yeah, you do use steroids. So it's false, and it's affirmative positive saying, hey, you got steroids in your system, all right? And then testing negative is, of course, then 0.90. And that's the chart that we're going to be using. Okay, so hopefully you guys understood what I mean by all this. Again, if you're using, just to recap here, if I'm using steroids, I should be tested positive, right? I definitely should have steroids in my system, and that's why it's 0.85. That's why that number's big. And if it's wrong, it's telling me I don't have steroids. That's why it's false negative. That's why it's 15%. And if I don't use steroids, the 0.8, that's saying, well, you know what? If I don't use steroids, I should be tested negative. I shouldn't have steroids in my system. So that's why it's 0.9. And what's given, it says a 10% false positive, because it's giving me an affirmative. It's a positive result, but it's false. So saying that I don't use steroids, but the test is saying, yeah, you really do use steroids. So it's wrong, but the test is wrong. That's why it's false positive. Okay? All right. So hopefully you guys are good with that. Let me just write one note here on the side here. Remember, if it says true, then the test showed correct results. And if it's false, the test showed incorrect results. Okay? All right. So let me just put on the side here, this is a true positive, and this is a false negative, and this is a false negative, or this is a false positive, sorry. And this one is a true negative. Okay? True negative. Okay, cool. So we got everything kind of labeled here all nicely. Okay, so let's answer some of these questions. If a bodybuilder is chosen at random, what is the probability that he uses steroids and tests positive? So first of all, the key word is and. So what are you going to do? It's got multiplication. Okay? So we're going to have to kind of keep going back and forth to this. So this chart on top here. So what we're saying here is the probability of using steroids times, so right, it says probability he uses steroids times the probability that he tests positive. All right, so well, what's the probability of using steroids? It's 0.2, right? Okay, I'm just pulling it off a chart here, so it's 0.20. And what's the probability that he tested positive? So it's 0.20, and then test positive is at 0.85, right? I'm just reading right off of here, 0.85, and so that gives me 0.17. Okay, so let's go down to the next one here. If a bodybuilder is chosen at random, what's the probability that he uses steroids? So again, using steroids. So we'll write it out here. Probability of use steroids. And test negative. So probability of test negative. Okay, so using steroids, again, just look at you're looking at the left side, right? That's the probability, 0.8 and 0.2. So using steroids is going to be, again, 0.2. But now he's testing negative. So that's 0.15. So that's going to be 0.03. I want to make a point, math fans. This number is going to be the lowest out of all the numbers that we're going to use. Okay. The reason this one's going to be the lowest is because most people don't use steroids. That's why that number is really low. And if you don't use steroids, right? Think of the probability of it saying, yeah, so you use steroids, which is low, but the probability of it's saying, no, you don't use steroids. That's really low too, because again, it's false, right? So you're most likely not going to be using steroids, and if you did use steroids, which is a small percentage, it should come back and say, yeah, I used steroids. And so that for the test to come back and say, no, you didn't use steroids, when you actually did use steroids, that's really low too. So there are two low numbers there. That's why this one is 0.03. Okay, it's really, really low that you're going to use steroids, but it's saying, no, you didn't use steroids. Okay? All right, so let's keep going here. C, if a bodybuilder is chosen, probability that he doesn't use steroids. So now he doesn't use steroids, which is going to be, let me write this out here, probability of doesn't use steroids times probability that he tests positive. Okay, so it doesn't use steroids is going to be then 0.80. That's the most common one. Doesn't use steroids, and he tests positive. Okay, so that's going to be 0.10. Now that should be a pretty low number too, because if you don't use steroids, you shouldn't be testing positive. You should be testing negative. Okay, and so if you multiply that out, that's 0.08. Okay, and then this last one here, if a bodybuilder is chosen at random, what's the probability he doesn't use steroids and tests negative? So go back here. Doesn't use steroids, which is going to be your 0.8, and test negative, which is 0.9. That is the most common one, because you don't use steroids, and the test has come back saying, yeah, you're right, you don't use steroids. So the test is correct. Okay, that's the most common one. So let me write this out. Probability of, again, doesn't use steroids, and it tests negative. Okay, so that's going to be 0.80, again a high number, and then it's coming back and saying, yeah, you're right, you don't use steroids, so that's a high number, 0.9. Okay, so that gives us 0.72. Okay, so that's the highest number. And if you notice, math fans, if I add all these numbers together, so 0.72 plus 0.08 is 0.8, 0.83, 1.0. It better equal 1.0 because it's either you use steroids, you didn't use steroids, and it either tests positive or negative. If you had all those probabilities, you better get one whole. Okay? Okay, E, it says if a bodybuilder is chosen at random, what is the probability that he tests positive? So testing positive, let's go back to our picture here. Oops, going too far here. If I test positive, do you guys agree it's going to be it's either going to be testing positive here or here? Oh, did I use the word or? Aha, add. Okay, so you're either using steroids and you test positive, or you're not using steroids and you're testing positive. Okay, so if I would write this out here. Okay, so again, it's or, and so you're going to write out here, I guess I'll do it in blue, probability of using steroids, okay, times probability of test positive, okay, which we calculated these out already, but I'm going to write this out again, or the probability of doesn't use steroids and test positive. Okay, so again, we've done this already, but let me just write it out. It's 0.20 using steroids and times 0.85. Okay, or, so it's going to be plus, doesn't use steroids, which is 0.80, and you test positive, which is actually pretty low, right? Because if you don't use steroids, you shouldn't be testing positive. All right, so if I add all these up together, I get, which if I just look back at it there, it's A plus C of the ones we've done already. Okay, but that adds up to 0.25. Okay, and then if a bodybuilder is chosen at random, was the probability that he tests negative? So it's kind of the same thing. Probability of using, so use steroids, times probability of test negative, plus probability of not use steroids, and testing negative. Okay, so that's going to be 0.20 using steroids but test negative, 0.15, and when I say or, I know I said and, but or So it's again plus, not using steroids, 0.80, and testing negative, 0.90. That's our most common one. Okay, and that is actually, for this one, is B plus D, the ones we've done already. And so that gives us 0.75. Okay, or you could have said 1 minus E, right? So 1 minus this guy, because you either are testing positive or 1 minus that is testing negative. So it gives us also 0.75. Or yeah, okay? Okay, cool. And then the last one here is if a bodybuilder already took the test and it showed that she did take steroids. I'm going to put she in there because women take steroids too, which obviously steroids are like a really bad thing to take anyway. Very, very bad for the heart. It says, then what is the probability that she actually took steroids? So guys, this is a conditional probability. This is saying the probability that you're using steroids, okay, given that she tested positive. Because it said, took the test, and it showed that she did take steroids. So it's given that she tested positive. So I'm saying, hey, what's the probability that she actually took steroids? That's this guy here, given that she tested positive. Okay? That's conditional probability. You already know something. She already tested positive. Okay? And I want to know what is the probability that she actually used steroids? Okay. Well, isn't that the probability of using steroids and testing positive divided by what? Remember, this number goes right here. So it's probability of testing positive. Okay? So if you plug those numbers in now, we already did probability of using steroids and testing positive. That's our 0.20. That's using steroids and testing positive is 0.85. So I'm getting that right off of that chart, right? So both of those divided by the probability of testing positive, which we already did. That's testing positive is that 0.25. Okay, so I can write this out again. 0.20 times 0.85 or 0.80 times 0.10. Okay, which was that was letter E. Okay, and then the 0.17 was letter A, just to kind of give you a little reference there. Okay, and so basically it's 0.17 divided by 0.25, and that gives us 0.68. Okay, so I definitely spent a lot of time here. I'm just looking at it's like 23 minutes on this, but this is an important topic, and got to know this for the final exam. All right, so you got to know for the quiz, for the test, for the final. It's on there. Okay, so that's what we refer to again as true and false, positive and negative. Okay, so now when you hear something when it says, oh hey, that it gave a false positive reading, you know the test was wrong, and it said, hey, you do have something, or it says, oh, that was a false negative, which means the test was wrong and you don't have something. Okay, that's what it means. So hopefully you guys are good to go with that. Okay, so the second part is really not that bad.